Welcome back everyone to our studies in Tsarist and communist Russia. This video is going to continue looking at the reign of Nicholas II, focusing on this idea of society and social developments up to 1914. We'll talk about the change in conditions of working and living conditions. We will talk about living in towns and the countryside. We'll talk about social divisions. We'll talk about cultural change. So we can see that, and we can probably make connections, we can draw connections and comparisons between the previous lesson when we focused on the economy and the video that we're going to be doing here, given the fact that a lot of the economic conditions drove some of the social tensions that we will see in this lesson. The fact that essentially social developments under Nicholas II were shaped by a combination of industrialization, which was a heavy focus of the last lesson, political tensions, as well as the growing influence of revolutionary ideologies. That will be something that we will explore in future videos, in the next lesson specifically. And so let's just begin by thinking about the impact of industrialization on living and working conditions in the towns and the countrysides of the Russian Empire. Fundamentally then, urbanization under Nicholas II was experienced as the result of rapid industrialization. So essentially, urbanization is the process of seeing as the result of industrial growth, cities beginning to grow and people moving into those cities to work in these industrial workforces. The creation of factories and the expansion of railways drew many people from the rural countryside into the cities in search for work. The result is that we see the growth of towns and cities, particularly St. Petersburg and Moscow. We know from the previous lesson, for example, that in terms of Moscow, it overtakes St. Petersburg in terms of size as we get to the turn of the 20th century. You could probably imagine that the working conditions and living conditions in these urban environments are particularly harsh. Labour was often grueling with very long hours, often as many as 12 hours a day. You see that there is low pay and quite dangerous machinery. Now, the workers were subjected to unsafe conditions, which would of course lead to frequent accidents and injuries. We know as well that from the first lesson on Nicholas II, the 1905 revolution begins on Bloody Sunday because of the demands of people who wish to see greater working conditions. A reduction, for example, from 12 hours a day in working to 8-hour day weeks. The idea here being that essentially they met the desire for more safe and more sustainable working conditions that was met with a backlash, that was met with the killings of hundreds of people and sparking a revolution. Now, if working conditions were quite bad, so too were living conditions. Because of just how rapid the industrialization process was at the late 1800s, early 1900s, in the Russian Empire, we can see that essentially the rapid influx of workers into the cities led to overcrowding. In places like St. Petersburg, cities and housing in cities were very, very much inadequate, many working in cramped, unsanitary conditions. We know that public health was quite poor, and an example, an illustration of that kind of public health problem was the fact that we saw between 1891 and 1892, under the reign of Alexander III, that there were cholera epidemics, and there was a famine that caused the deaths of as many as 500,000 people. That is partially the result of these kinds of conditions that were in place as the result of these urbanization policies. And these cholera epidemics and these other diseases like tuberculosis and typhus were widespread. The countryside then didn't really get much better in terms of living and working conditions. The majority of Russia's population did live in rural areas. We noted that that was as high as 80% in the previous video. This meant then that agriculture remained the backbone of the economy, despite seeing quite significant amounts of industrial growth. The kind of overtaking of the agricultural sector by industry doesn't really happen until maybe during the First World War, but then after the First World War, when we start to see the industrialization policies of people like Stalin, for example, the 5-year plans. The agricultural economy then was predominantly traditional, so this relied on serfdom-like conditions in many regions. Despite the reforms of 1861, the Emancipation Edict of the serfs, most peasants still lived in poverty, and were burdened by very heavy taxation. We know already about redemption payments that essentially meant that peasants were in poverty and in debt for many, many decades. The early 20th century saw rising discontent in the countryside due to the ongoing struggles faced by the peasantry. The agrarian crisis, marked by poor harvests, land shortages, and feudal-like arrangements, prompted these uprisings. And so fundamentally then, when we think about this, the sort of summary of these conditions, we can see that quite clearly there was major population shifts taking place. We know that there was a significant amount of urban growth. I noted in the previous video, for example, that the population of St. Petersburg nearly doubled from 1,033,000 in 1890 to 1,905,000 in 1910, essentially 1 million to 2 million people between 1890 and 1910. That's a massive population increase in just 20 years. Similar experiences were felt by places like Moscow as well during this period. From here, then, we can start to think about how class was divided and the social divisions that we see. At the top of the class structure continues the nobility and the aristocracy, as you can probably imagine. Despite the loss of power following the emancipation of the serfs, the Russian nobility still remained as a major force, retaining significant privileges. They controlled large estates, they exerted substantial influence over the economy and over the political system. Many members of the aristocracy remained deeply conservative. They remained deeply loyal to the Tsar, just like under Alexander III as well as Alexander II. Russia's growing industrial economy leads to the rise of a small but influential middle class, a bourgeois society that we start to see developing as well as the result of industrialization. This is similar across all different parts of the world when we think about the industrialization process. The class was made up of industrialists, merchants, professionals, and was increasingly politically aware and sought greater and greater representation within government. Of course, government at the time was representative of the Duma since the 1905 revolution. Many middle-class Russians became supporters of constitutional reforms, even if their influence was still limited by the autocratic nature of government. The industrial working class, the proletariat, was also growing rapidly. We noted already, as I mentioned a second ago, the population of St. Petersburg between 1890 and 1910 doubles, essentially. These people were often very deeply exploited, with living in quite appalling conditions and facing considerable social inequality. This class became the centre of revolutionary activity, particularly when we think about the rise of socialist movements. The social divisions then between workers and the elite would lead to significant unrest, particularly after the failures of the 1905 revolution. In terms of cultural changes, during Nicholas II's reign, we can see that education is gradually expanded, but it still remains very inadequate for the majority of the population. While the government, for example, did establish new schools, particularly within urban environments, the quality of the education was often poor. And we can measure education levels by looking at literacy rates. Literacy rates in Russia were relatively low compared to Western Europe. By the turn of the 20th century, by 1900, there was a slow increase in literacy rates, partially due to the efforts of government and partially due to social organizations that attempted to try and improve education in towns and the countryside. We can see that in 1897, for example, the literacy rate was estimated to be about 25% of the Russian population. And again, by 1917, it had increased, but it still remained far below Western standards. In terms of cultural and artistic movements, the so-called Russian intelligentsia, the educated elites, the writers, the artists, the intellectuals, became increasingly politicized under Nicholas II. For example, writers like Leo Tolstoy and Anton Chekhov criticized the social injustices of Russian societies. Other writers, like, for example, Maxim Gorky, became increasingly more radicalized and started to support things like workers' rights and social revolution. Russian literature and arts would flourish to an extent during the reign of Nicholas II, even as political repression began to grow. We can see this with evidence of certain writers and composers and poets like, for example, Alexander Bloch, and composers like Sergei Rachmaninoff, both reflecting the social tensions and struggles of the era. By the 1910s, censorship had tightened even further, and many artists and intellectuals had to seek alternative ways to try and express dissent towards this kind of opposition. One of the main reasons for all this is because of the influence of the Church. The Russian Orthodox Church remained a powerful, very powerful institution throughout the entirety of Nicholas's reign, because Nicholas was deeply devout and the Russian Orthodox Church was closely aligned with the monarchy. And so when we think about writers like Tolstoy and Chekhov, and we think about poets like Bloch and composers like Rachmaninoff, we can see that essentially these influences began to affect the influence of the Russian Orthodox Church, such that there was the beginnings of a decline as these intellectual and political movements started to challenge traditional authority. Finally then, the role of women was, as you can probably imagine, beginning to change slowly during this period, but it should be noted that the traditional gender roles remained dominant throughout. Some women, especially in urban areas, gained access to education and professional work, and we did start to see something of a development of women's suffrage movements, but these movements faced opposition and repression for the most part. Women did increasingly enter the workforce in urban centres, particularly in places like factories, although they were less paid than their male counterparts. As you can imagine, no change there. The next lesson is going to continue to think about society and social changes, but specifically thinking about opposition, the ideas of opposition to Nicholas II, specifically looking at liberal opposition, socialist opposition, and then thinking about radical opposition, Marxist anarchist groups particularly.